This session is now being recorded. It wasn't before. And I will be sharing the recording along with the kind of supporting materials, the PowerPoint, the references. Those will all be coming via email at some point in the next few days, let's say by the end of Saturday or something like that. And so, yeah, you don't feel like you necessarily have to like take notes or whatever, because you can, but you'll also have anything that I present here, you'll also get. I think as far as logistical things, that's what I want to say. Please don't wait until the end to ask questions. I am anticipating kind of like consuming the full 45 minutes for exposition, right? So at 4:15 my time, I'll be sure to kind of like wrap up the exposition piece. I have a few minutes that I can stick around and answer some questions, but even if I don't answer your questions at that point in time at the end, if I have a record of them because you've sent them, then I can still answer them that way. So I don't anticipate necessarily being able to answer the questions as they come in, like I typically would, but if you send them in through that Q&A feature, then I have a record of them, and then I can still answer them after the fact. So if you'd like to do that, then I would strongly encourage it. And I think that really is the only other logistical thing that I wanted to say. There is a really good question about part 2. There was an original date set for part 2, but that was before I got some deadlines from my advisor at school. So I promise that when I send out the information for part 1 in terms of the recording and the supporting materials, that I will also include the registration link for part 2, and you can discard it or you can go ahead and register, but the date will be finalized at that point in time. So yeah, that's kind of just like my limitation at the moment. Let's see. Yeah, I think we are good with this for now. Lo que ven o lo que van a ver en la pantalla ahorita es lo que yo voy a llamar mi marco teórico. Es decir, estos son los pilares de los cuales yo partí cuando estaba diseñando esta sesión. Y me parece importante recalcar que como son pilares, eso quiere decir que yo no te voy a tratar de convencer de esos pilares. I am working from the assumptions that we have, either that you agree with these tenets already, or that you're willing to suspend disbelief for now and go along with it, right? So explicitly what I mean, one of the assumptions that I'm making is that we all agree and understand that oral language is the bedrock of literacy development, and that if we did not have oral language, we would not have print. And what I mean by that most explicitly is that in the session, I am not going to make references to the importance of vocabulary development. That's not what I study. That's not what I do. In the session, I'm not going to make references to the importance of reading aloud to kids, whether it's in English or Spanish, Chinese, whatever. Again, that isn't what I do. That's not what I study. Pero eso no quiere decir que esas cosas no son importantes. Claro que son importantes. I am working from the assumption that we have that understanding already. Or at the very least, that you can imagine a world in which developing vocabulary and reading out loud and talking about syntax, i.e. these things that we call oral language development, are key. I will not be addressing them here. I will, however, be assuming that we have some of that already, right? The other piece, y esto es muy importante que yo recalque ahorita, yo sé que para muchos de ustedes les hubiese gustado que yo estuviese presentando toda esta información exclusivamente en español. Y yo entiendo por qué, de verdad que sí. Como maestro de dual language hace muchos años, yo nunca recibí, ¿cómo se llama? Fomentación así docente en español. Nunca. Nunca pasó. So I understand why you might want that. At the same time, we also need to be really, really clear that that a lot of our emergent bilinguals are working with adults at some point throughout the day who might not speak the other language, in this case, Spanish. So does that mean that that adult is now off the hook for helping that child bridge these cross-linguistic connections? I would say no, right? Just because I don't speak Chinese doesn't mean that if I'm working in a Chinese DLI context, that I shouldn't know something about Chinese in order to help either understand why the child is saying or doing the things that they're doing, or to help them bridge those connections across languages. And I don't necessarily think that you have to be bilingual in order to do that, though perhaps it might help. And for that reason, I see this session as more of a leveling the playing field. Let's make sure that all people, regardless of whether they speak Spanish, know something about what research shows about Spanish acquisition in terms of literacy acquisition. Because it turns out that actually some of that information might be really useful for us, even if we don't speak the language. Specifically, if we're working with children who speak Spanish or are learning to speak Spanish in order to then learn to read and write in it. Right, so that is another proposition that I'm making. That's an assumption that I'm making, that if I deliver this content in English, I will have a broader reach, and therefore that we will be able to support more students. It does not mean that in the future no van a haber sesiones que sean exclusivamente en español, pero me parece que ahorita no estamos en ese momento porque no hemos equilibrado nuestros conocimientos todavía. Now, you might disagree with that, and I think that's totally fine, but that's kind of where I'm departing from. Y la última cosa que quiero decir es que hay muchos investigadores en Latinoamérica, en España, que se han dedicado a estudiar cómo es que se desarrolla la alfabetización en español. Esos estudios son relevantes para nosotros aquí, even if we are working in a context where we're trying to foster biliteracy. And if your proposition is that we can only leverage research that was conducted with emergent bilinguals, and that the research that was conducted with English-only speakers and Spanish-only speakers, as we'll see today, and that those two sets of research are completely unapplicable or inapplicable to this population here in the middle, then I would say why? Why is it that you think that? What is your evidence base for thinking that? Because what makes, I think, a profession different from a hobby, one of the many things, is that a profession is guided by evidence base. Evidence might not be able to answer every question, that's not possible, but it should inform certain decisions. And if we're excluding these, I'm calling them these two bodies, but it's really one body of research, then why? What allows us to do that? What is the defense that we have? I haven't been able to find it. And so this is my way of saying that we are going to look at a lot of research that was conducted primarily in Spanish monolingual populations. And I think that is actually incredibly useful in the context that we're in when we're trying to foster biliteracy. So these are my assumptions. If you disagree with them, I completely understand. I'll let you decide what you want to do with that information. But I wanted to be clear that these are the principles that I am departing from. Now, by way of an agenda, I'll just let you look at the different questions that I hope to tackle today. And I'll be honest, in terms of timing, right? Like I said, this is a 45-minute session. I can't tell if I have too much content or not enough content, but kind of time will reveal that as we go. And so with that, we'll get started with our first question here, which is what makes the Spanish syllable so salient? Salient meaning, yeah, like for those of us who speak Spanish or work with kids who speak Spanish, it isn't necessarily hard for them to develop an understanding of the syllable. In Spanish, it is very salient. It is easily accessible. But what actually contributes to that salience or saliency? I'm not sure what the noun form is there. In order to answer that question, I think we need to be thinking about what is a syllable. And at its basic level, we can define a syllable here, right? Like that is the rectangular block that you see on the screen. A syllable has components. One component that every syllable must have is what we call el núcleo. El núcleo vocal es la vocal. That is the vowel sound. By definition, every syllable needs to have a vowel sound. Beyond that, some syllables also have lo que se llama un ataque, or the onset. Esos son los sonidos que vienen directamente antes de la vocal. Recuerda, estamos hablando de una sílaba nada más. Ma, a. Esa es una sílaba, sería el ataque, a sería el núcleo. In addition, we can also have this thing that we call a coda. The coda is what comes immediately after the vowel sound. These are consonant sounds, these are consonants. These by definition are usually 99.99% of the time, and in Spanish 100% of the time, vowel sounds. Okay? Entonces, podemos descomponer una sílaba entre los sonidos que están adentro de la sílaba. Y dependiendo de dónde está el sonido, le podemos llamar el ataque, el núcleo o la coda. That's it. It is not surprising, then, that if we were to look at the syllabic structures of English and Spanish, we find some differences, but perhaps not in the places that we were expecting. And one way to answer the question around, well, why is the Spanish syllable so salient, is that many people will say, well, yeah, Spanish is basically CV syllables. Ma, me, mi, mo, mu, sa, se, si, so, lu, la, 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 la. Bueno, ¿qué es verdad eso? Vamos a ver. Podemos decir que una sílaba no compleja, es decir, simple, es una sílaba que no tiene más de un consonante ni en el ataque ni en la coda. That is what a simple syllable is. In this case, we're talking about simple onset specifically. That means that you only have one consonant sound at most in that onset. So these are the different kinds of syllables that we would call simple syllables. Now, if we are looking at this structures, right, and we're comparing Spanish to English, broadly, what we see is that actually, as a percentage of all the syllables that exist in that language, most of them in both languages are simple. If you break it down a little more, that's where the differences start to emerge. More than half of all the syllables, this is what you see here, more than half of all the syllables that you see in Spanish, that you have in Spanish, are just CV. But that's half. What about the other half? So it's not fair to say that Spanish is made up of predominantly or even primarily, unless by predominantly or primarily you mean half. If you mean half, then fine. What if we look now at complex syllables? Complex syllables, in this case, we're looking at complex only, complex onset specifically. All that means is that you have more than one consonant in that onset position, right? So before the vowel sound. So en español, una palabra como flor, tiene dos consonantes directamente antes de la vocal. In English, incidentally, the word flow, those two sounds are part of the onset, and then you have the vowel sound O. So if we look there, we also see some similarities. It's not like we don't have any of those kinds of syllables in Spanish. And it's not like we have significantly more in English. So yes, there are differences between the two languages up to this point, but it's not necessarily convincing that these are the differences that explain why the syllable is so much more salient in Spanish than it is in English. As an aside, I'll say that just with this slide alone, I could train for about 3 to 6 hours, because each row contains a whole wealth of information that we could then choose to unpack and say, well, if we wanted to forge these cross-linguistic transfers, then what would that look like? That isn't the topic of today, but it's something that you can think about and say, whoa, given these overlaps, then what can I actually do with that? One area where the two languages really diverge is when you look at complex codas. Those are the consonants that come after the vowel sound. And if you look there, that is what we find. So, como un reto, aquellos de ustedes que hablan español, si piensas en una sílaba que tenga más de un consonante en la coda, hay pocas, hay como 3, 4, 5. Yo sé de 3 específicamente. Es como un porcentaje de todas las sílabas que existen en español, prácticamente no existen. Son bien infrecuentes en español. English, on the other hand, has a lot of them, and a lot of different ones. So that 7% is actually incredibly diverse. There's a lot of complex clusters in the coda in English. Now, think about what it would mean to use this information to create instructional materials that really cater to fostering cross-linguistic transfer. What are the kinds of activities, perhaps, that we might be able to do in one language that we could then just basically piggyback off in the second language, because those two things overlap? And what are the things that really we'd have to focus exclusively on in that other language because we just don't have them in this one? As opposed to having to teach everything from scratch as though there is no conversation between the two languages in our heads. So I'll leave that for us to kind of ponder. But the big idea here is that syllabic structure, it's not really clear that this is the reason why the syllable in Spanish is so much more salient than the one in English. Another place that we can look and that people have looked is this idea of timing. You might have heard this before. Oh yeah, Spanish is a syllable timed language. Well, what that means, at least literally, is that each syllable in articulation takes up about the same amount of time. Entonces, cuando yo digo ballena, supuestamente cada sílaba en la palabra ballena es prácticamente igual en términos de duración. That's what it means to be syllable time. English, on the other hand, is what we call a stress-timed language. It means that the stress syllable carries with it more weight, and in doing so, it kind of obscures the other syllables. So when I say mountainous, it's pretty evident that the first syllable is stressed, mountainous, mount, and that one takes up more time coming out of your mouth, and the other ones are kind of relegated a bit. And so people say, well, given this difference between having a syllable time language and a stress time language, that also contributes to the saliency of the Spanish syllable. Y te digo, parte de la razón por la cual yo creo que esa lógica ha sido tan popular es porque siempre estamos contrastando el español con el inglés. Pero si vemos y si estudiamos el español como su propia lengua y vamos a medir lo que están diciendo la gente de habla española, te vas a dar cuenta que, y no lo estoy diciendo yo, este es un estudio del 1983, hace tiempísimo. No hemos encontrado ejemplos de personas que cuando estén hablando en español hablen de esa manera. And if you think about it, it just makes so much sense. How could every syllable really take up the same amount of space coming out of time? That would be very robotic. There's actually a lot of factors that influence how much time each syllable takes up in speech. Whether or not that syllable is stressed is one of them, but it's not the only one. Right. So my big point here is that if we're looking to timing to explain the saliency of the Spanish language, or the Spanish syllable rather, that's not particularly persuasive because we have lots of examples of words in, or just utterances in Spanish that don't behave like this at all. One reason why timing does matter, and this will be relevant in part 2, is that we do have this concept of stress in Spanish, just like we do in English. Right? Cuando yo digo leí, es diferente cuando yo digo ley. La ley del país y yo leí ayer no tienen nada que ver una con la otra. That would be an example of Spanish being stress timing like. En inglés, lo que pasa, igual with this idea of stress, if you think about the words record and record, I've changed to the stress syllable. And in doing so, even though those words have very similar meanings, I've changed their syntactic usage, right? So stress does play a really important role in each language, but not for the reasons that people typically talk about. My point here is that we're not looking to timing to really explain the saliency. So where does that leave us? Vowels, y son las vocales. If you were to say, Hamilton, in 1 minute, explain why the syllable is so salient in Spanish, which I really need to be doing, it's because of the vowels. We have 5 very clear vowel sounds in Spanish. Each one has a very clear articulatory gesture that is not in any way confusable with the other one. And therefore, it helps us be able to distinguish the syllables. That's really primarily what it comes down to. And that is exactly what these 2 studies show. Again, this is from the 70s. Importantly, what this, in particular, this study in 1979, what they also show is that the vowel in Spanish does not change depending on the context that it's in. Es decir, independientemente de qué consonante siga la vocal o venga antes de la vocal va a ser la vocal, no va a cambiar. In English, that is not true. In English, and that's what these studies show, the identity of the vowel sound in English is intricately tied to the context in which it's found. And so that means that depending on the word that you're saying, whether it has this consonant before it or this kind of consonant after, whether it's stressed or unstressed, it might actually change the vowel sound. I don't show it here, but if you could imagine me overlapping the English simple vowels on top of the Spanish ones, you would have a very crowded space. E, the same in both languages. In English, like an in, eh. That would be like right there. And then you have the Spanish and then you have the eh. Your mouth opens just a little bit more. Your mouth is not as tight, right? It's more relaxed, so to speak. But those identities, even though that's how we talk about them, they actually change depending on the word that we're using that has that vowel sound. The other point that I will make about English vowels, which is related to timing in a way, is that even though both languages have this idea of a stressed syllable, in English, we also have this side effect, which is vowel reduction. A syllable that is in a multisyllabic word that is unstressed, right? An unstressed syllable in a multisyllabic word, there's a very high risk that it gets reduced. A good example of this, think about a word like salad. Kemi Dan, if you ever watches, I 100% got that example from you. When you say salad, your mouth really only opens once, salad. The second syllable, your mouth actually closes. That is a vowel reduction. We don't have that in Spanish. The identity of the syllable is preserved. In English, it is not, especially in unstressed syllable, called the schwa. The schwa makes things very complicated in English, not just for spelling, but even for simple articulation. So all this to say that yes, the vowel in Spanish is very salient. And because of its saliency, because of its consistency, it really helps us demarcate the syllables in Spanish. That concludes kind of like that question. Why is the Spanish syllable so salient? Tiene que ver con las vocales. Tiene todo que ver con las vocales. No es tan solo que hay pocas vocales en español, aunque es cierto. También es que las vocales no cambian. So think about the implications of that for instruction in a DLI setting. When you have two languages that behave fundamentally differently when it comes to vowels, which is the core, el núcleo silábico. Now, given this saliency of the syllable, how does that relate to Spanish word reading? In other words, like if kids can syllabicate words in Spanish, does that tell us anything about what they can read in Spanish? What does that relationship look like? Has it been explored? What has it found? So sorry, I was just asking a question. That's why I can't be looking over there. And I think one important thing, and I'm going to do this kind of like in a very cursory manner, but there's lots of different places that you can go to for specific information on this topic. When we talk about in this case, notice that I'm using the term syllabic awareness. This is my attempt to kind of unpack that a little bit. So very often you'll hear people talk about phonological awareness, and even in research, right? Like one person will operationalize this construct of phonological awareness one way, and another person will operationalize it in a completely different way. And you're like, but wait, you're talking about different things and you're calling them the same thing. But why is that? So broadly speaking, we can say that phonological awareness is our ability to perceive different fragments of speech. And the way that I think of it is that imagine that you have speech coming out of this megaphone. Lo podemos dividir en sílabas, cuántas sílabas hay en la palabra o cuántas sílabas hay en esa oración, si quieres. Podemos decir cuántos fonemas hay en esa palabra o en esa sílaba. In English, we can be also looking at onset and rhyme, right? Like, let's take the word cat. The onset is k, the rhyme is at. So you have all of these different kinds of phonological awareness. But what they all have in common is that it has to do with utterance, right? There is some utterance that is produced, and now we're thinking about what are the kind of the pieces that make up that utterance. Eso es todo. Now, in terms of, and this point is secondary, but so important, especially when I think we get 2 slides from now. By definition, we have operationalized this construct, phonemic or phonological awareness, as one that is assessed orally. So you are never going to find a phonological awareness measure that has kids read something as a measure of their phonological awareness. No, that isn't how it gets measured. You're either saying a word, they repeat it, and then you ask them something about the word. Okay, Jimmy, la palabra es mesa, dime mesa. Mesa, muy bien. ¿Cuáles son las sílabas en mesa? Mesa, o lo que sea. Muy bien, esas son las sílabas. Okay, that's how it gets operationalized, orally. Sure, you might show them a picture like, okay, ¿cómo se llama esto? Mesa, okay, ahora dime la sílaba. Fine. But we're not showing them like the word mesa and having them like read it, because then that is not how we've operationalized this construct of phonological awareness. Pero te digo, just because something gets operationalized for assessment one way does not mean that is how it should be instructed. And that's where I'll leave it for now. In terms of this, return to the original question, right? Like, what does syllabic awareness tell us about word reading? Let's look at this one study. Now, I'm going to go into detail in this. I'll go into detail on this one study. But what I want you to appreciate is that there's actually lots of other studies that have done the same thing pretty much, and that have found basically the same thing. And those are some of the ones that you'll see come up on the sides here in a moment. En este caso, Ariel Cuadro, un investigador de Uruguay, lo que hizo fue que tomó una muestra de 44 estudiantes en primer grado en Uruguay, Montevideo, y les dio una serie de exámenes, de tareas de conciencia fonológica, tareas de lectura, tareas de escritura, y también hizo pruebas de lenguaje oral, right? Y a raíz de esas pruebas, trató de destacar relaciones entre las habilidades de X y cómo X tenía que ver con G, la cosa que él estaba prediciendo, ¿no? So I'll give you a moment, for those of you who can read in Spanish, and kind of just quickly look at this paragraph that's there. And for those who don't panic. These kids were assessed on syllabic awareness. And the way that they, in this study, operationalized syllabic awareness was identify the first syllable in a word. I say a word, you repeat the word, tell me the first syllable. That's it. And what they found is that 73% of these first graders could reliably identify the first syllable in a word. That same sample of 44 students, more than 90% of them could not read any words, and these were real words. They could not spell words. Es decir, ellos tenían conciencia silábica y no podían leer ni escribir. I do not know how else to say this. And it shouldn't be surprising given what we just talked about. Even anecdotally, it is not surprising to have kids develop syllabic awareness, and that having nothing to do with their ability to actually read or spell words. Ese es el caso en inglés, y vemos que es el caso en español también. But you know what's interesting? Is that those kids who couldn't read and write in Spanish, if you look at a segmentation measure, specifically phonemic segmentation, la sílaba es, o la palabra es mes, dime los sonidos en mes, el 11%. O sea, es como que hay una relación entre no poder leer y escribir y no tener conciencia fonémica. Y precisamente eso es lo que vemos. Lo vemos en Colombia, lo vimos en Argentina. Esta señora, Ana María Borsone, no sé si te acuerdas, ese mismo nombre lo viste hace como 3 o 4 placas. En Argentina, desde los 70s y los 80s, ha estado investigando esto de la alfabetización en español. Y su equipo, ¿no? Entonces, lo vimos en Argentina hace años. Esto fue un meta-análisis que hicieron, analizando bastante diferentes estudios de diferentes países, incluyendo estudios que están comparando a estudiantes que están aprendiendo en español y estudiantes que están aprendiendo en español e inglés, o sea, en programas bilingües. Encuentra lo mismo. La conciencia silábica en España con Gutiérrez, esta es parte de otro equipo de ¿cómo se llama? Juan Jiménez. La conciencia silábica no necesariamente predice el desempeño en la lectura en español. ¿Por qué? Porque es muy simple. Para la mayoría de los niños entrando en kinder, en primer grado, la conciencia silábica no nos dice nada sobre su desarrollo en términos de la lectura. No sé cómo más decir eso. Which means, well, I'm not even going to tell right now. Ahora, si no estamos viendo a la sílaba, ¿para dónde veo? Muéstrame, dime. Me estás diciendo que no veas la sílaba, ok, o que la sílaba no predice nada en la lectura, entonces ¿a dónde voy? El fonema. And at this point, and I think this will probably be like the last big piece of content, when we think about the phoneme, most of us think of English, phonemic awareness, porque eso es lo que nos han dicho, que el fonema importa mucho más en inglés que en español. But I actually want to start this piece by talking about this really famous, widely cited study by Goldenberg et al. It's a really, really cool study because they looked at populations in California and in Mexico. And in California, they looked at children they really followed them K first, so those 2 years. And they looked at basically their achievement on a bunch of different measures, specifically phonemic awareness and reading, comprehension, etc., both in English and in Spanish if they were in a DLI program, or just in English if they were in an English-only program, and in Mexico, obviously, just solamente en español. So that's kind of like the backdrop, right? And I'll just have you read some of it yourselves. Right here, this is from their introduction, and I just want you to pay attention to how they're using the term phonemic awareness. What I would point out really simply is that we don't get a definition of phonemic. What does phonemic awareness instruction look like? Based on the rest of the article and just other articles, it stands to reason that they're defining phonemic awareness instruction as instruction that is delivered primarily orally, where we are focused on sound. Okay, sensible definition, right? That's how we assessed it. So it stands to reason that then the instruction is going to look like that too. Now, the following is how they describe the instruction that a typical child might get in Mexico, specifically where they studied or where they're pulling this sample from. So I'm not making this from the article. Empezando aquí. Y lo que yo quiero subrayar, although children are indeed taught letter sound combinations, letter sound combinations, and how letters combine or blend to form syllables and words. So this, when you have a sound and that sound is represented by print, because there's print involved, suddenly doesn't merit the name phonemic awareness. They would call this maybe phonics or something. But if it did not have the print, then it would be phonemic awareness instruction. That is a fallacy. It is not necessarily the case that because we assess phonemic instruction without print, that the only instruction for phonemic awareness that matters in terms of counting toward phonemic awareness is one that is delivered without print. These children are getting phonemic awareness instruction by virtue of the fact that they are being trained to think about sounds and how those sounds are being represented in print. Y da la casualidad que están ensemblando esos fonemas para crear sílabas y palabras en español. If this is not phonemic awareness instruction, then I don't know what is. And this, what is being described here in Mexico, is actually not that different from what gets described as happening in España, por ejemplo. Every graphing phoneme correspondent was explicitly taught in first grade, empezando con las consonantes simples y después con las correspondencias más difíciles. Este es el sonido, así se escribe. O esta es la letra, así se escribe. Esta es la letra, así se pronuncia. That forging of the sound and the print, that is the whole point of phonemic awareness. To say that phonemic awareness instruction, as it's implied here, only merits the name if it is delivered orally, devoid of print, is a colossal misconception. Does that mean that you always include print with phonemic awareness instruction? That is an instructional question depending on the group that you are with. But what I can say pretty unequivocally is that you are training phonemic awareness. You are training awareness of the phoneme if you are explicitly connecting the print and the sound. Fíjate, lo que no hemos visto, y no lo vas a ver porque no existe, no vemos ninguna referencia implicando la importancia, directamente o indirectamente, de la memorización de la sílaba. Y no la vas a encontrar porque no existe ese tipo de evidencia. Hasta donde yo sé, no hay un estudio de ningún país que compare grupos, un grupo que esté memorizándose sílabas y otro grupo que esté aprendiendo con fonemas y grafemas. And I suspect that that study hasn't been done because we recognize that Spanish is an alphabetic language, which means quite literally that the sounds are being represented by individual sounds, phonemes are being represented by graphemes. And that if you can master the alphabetic code, right, then you have access to a whole wealth of words. I.e., there's a lot fewer things to memorize, 26, 27 letters, depending on how you count, as opposed to 800, 900 syllables. You can derive the syllable. You cannot derive the letter sound. That's completely arbitrary. So where does that leave us in terms of this little section on how important or how syllabic awareness predicts or not word reading in Spanish? The short answer is that it doesn't, because kids are too good at it from the beginning without any instruction on your part. So what does that mean for kind of like an everyday implication? Well, if syllabic awareness is one of the measures that we're using as a screener to help us identify students at the beginning of kinder or even first grade who might need additional support, you're really only flagging the ones that are like really struggling. You're missing a whole bunch of kids because kids are too good at syllabic awareness. A better predictor of word reading in K in first grade, tanto en inglés como en español, y eso es lo que habla este artículo de Jiménez, ¿dónde está? Está en la lista de referencia. What they tried to do was develop this screener for monolingual Spanish monolingual populations. And what they found, is that in kinder, specifically in kinder, there are two things that predict word reading by the end of kinder really well. Do you know your letter names, letter sounds? And can you identify the first sound? It's almost like the first sound that these students did have. This is that study in Uruguay. These students could find the first sound. What they didn't have was the notion of the alphabetic principle. But if we can build off the first sound, we can start to build that understanding of the alphabetic principle. A short way of saying this is that, in effect, the same measure might very well be able to tell us information about their development in both languages. En este caso, en inglés y en español. Those measures being, do you know your letter names, letter sounds? Y o, dime el primer sonido de la palabra, sea en inglés o sea en español. 5 minutes. Technically, there's a whole other section that I wanted to cover. But what I will say, by way of summarizing that section that I won't get into now, is this. If it were true that the syllable is the most important thing about Spanish word reading acquisition, then we would expect that when syllables get activated in Spanish, it would really help us read a lot faster. And what they actually find is that that is true only under very specific conditions. Disregard this stuff at the top because I didn't get to explain it. The beginning syllable of the word seems to be critical in helping us recognize the word in full. La primera sílaba. Es decir, and I'll stop confusing me by not sharing that. Es decir, cuando estamos leyendo en español, el silabeo maletín eso no es un indicador de un lector que puede comprender lo que está leyendo. In the same way that when a child is decoding in English, that is not a good indicator for their comprehension. In fact, we know that disfluency in recognition, in word recognition, plays an important role in inhibiting our understanding because now we don't have all of our mental resources available to comprehend. Es decir, un lector en español que sabe lo que está haciendo y entiende lo que está leyendo, no está pensando en las palabras sílaba por sílaba. Esa persona ya ha ensamblado esas sílabas y tiene una representación de esa palabra en su mente y la puede accesar. Ya tiene acceso a esa palabra leyéndola. When we are working with, so what does that mean, right? Like, if you're saying that like el silabeo isn't actually how proficient readers do it, then what are you telling me then? That if we are focusing on helping students en español entender que hay fonemas y hay grafemas y que esos fonemas se pueden unir para crear sílabas en palabra, esa es precisamente la práctica que ellos necesitan, ahora soy argentino, ellos, para poder leer mejor en español. It's almost like we're trying to take a shortcut and saying, hey, Spanish is very syllabic, so I'll just teach you the syllables, and if you memorize the syllables, then you'll be good to go. Well, does that work in English? If we just have kids memorize words, does that make them become great comprehenders? No, because there's too many words, you cannot memorize them all. Igual en español. O sea, es inaudito que tenemos una lengua, una ortografía, que usa un alfabeto y que lo estemos tratando como que si fuese exclusivamente sílabas. We do not have a syllabary, I think that's what it's called, in Spanish. We don't have that. For a good reason. Because we have an alphabet instead. Right? And so what I will say by way of summarizing, and this is, I can do it. Probably on this slide, the last bullet is most important. If our goal is to have students memorize syllables in Spanish, we are missing out on invaluable instructional time. Pero también quiero decir otra cosa. Las personas que tú ves aquí en esta placa, Ana María Borzón en Argentina, Silvia de Fior en España, Ariel Cuadro en Uruguay y Juan Jiménez también de España. Estas personas y muchas, muchas más que no están en la pantalla. Oh, perdón, no ves nada. Creo que ahora sí, tal vez. Espero que sí. Ana María Borzone, Ariel Cuadro, Silvia de Fior, Juan Jiménez. Estas personas han dedicado sus vidas a aprender, estudiar, investigar cómo es que se desarrolla la alfabetización en español. And I think it is such a shame that when we are talking about biliteracy, we are not including people who have dedicated their lives to understanding how one half of that equation, of that biliterate equation, develops. If you are so convinced that this research in Spanish and the other research, which is really not other, research in English is not relevant for your population, then I invite you to explain to yourself, not to me, I'm nobody. Explain to yourself, why? Why is this research totally irrelevant? Are we saying that we have fundamentally different neurobiology? That we somehow learn to read differently because of that? Because now we have we have no evidence that that is the case. And more importantly, and I want to be really clear and pragmatic about this, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes that we have? Do we have children who are actually biliterate? Do we have children who are biliterate because of the educational system and the opportunities they have been afforded within those systems? Because if I have a student who's biliterate because I tutor him at home or I hire someone to tutor him at home, that's a very different scenario. My big point here is that if we are having conversations about fostering biliteracy or even about supporting our English learners, we should be bringing to the table people from all over the world who have studied language and literacy acquisition in those languages. It is a huge missed opportunity not to do that. And with that, that is, I guess, the end of my exposition.